Well, I get the privilege of reading to you an entire chapter book, not in one sitting. We'll read 2 chapters today. We're going to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And before I read it to you, I have a couple things to share with you. So while we're reading it, it'll make a lot more sense. So the book is called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's by C.S. Lewis. And the book is what's called an allegory. It's kind of a very fancy word. You don't normally learn about it till you're an older kid. But an allegory is a type of writing where the story has a deeper second meaning. And this book is an allegory. And the deeper second meaning is actually a picture of Jesus Christ coming to save us from our sin, dying, coming back to life. All of that is in this story, but not as actual Jesus, but in an allegory form where the deeper meaning is about Jesus, but the surface level story is a fantasy story, so an imaginative pretend story. So as we read, I want to challenge you to look for hints about the hidden second meaning. And as we go along, and we'll talk about it, and we'll look and find clues together as we do that. So before we read, I just want to show you some pictures and tell you some words that you're going to hear in the first chapter that might be a little strange to you. First, the book was written in the year 1950. And so how long ago was that? You can do the math. I'm not going to say the answer. So it's 2020 now, and if you subtract 2020, you subtract 1950 from 2020, you'll find how many years ago this was written. And it was a long time ago. And so the setting is the time and the place. And the place is in England. And so the people, the person who wrote this, C.S. Lewis, and the characters in it are from England. And so in England, they do speak English differently than we do here in America. And it's several years ago. The story also takes place during World War II, and World War II happened in 1939 to 1945. So even the story was written after that, but the setting of the story, or when the story happens, is during that time. So let's talk about some words that they use that you might not be so familiar with. The first one is the word air raid. An air raid is an attack in a place in which a place is bombed by military airplanes. So in the story, the characters are in England, and they're being bombed by Germans during World War II. Okay, so they, their cities are getting bombed by military airplanes. It's a very brief mention in the book, but you just want to know what that means. They actually talk about that there's a wireless, and a wireless is another word for radio. And so I put a picture of what an old-fashioned radio might have looked like from then. And this radio, this is in a time period when there's no cell phones, no computers, and no TVs. So when you wanted news, you had to turn on the radio and listen. And that was your main source of finding information and your main source of entertainment. Okay? The word parcel will be in the story. So there's a picture of some parcels. They're, usually brown boxes wrapped in paper, tied with string. They mention there's a blue bottle dead on the windowsill, and a blue bottle is just a type of fly. And then they also mentioned mothballs, and this is a picture of mothballs, and they were used as a pesticide. It actually kills moths, and it keeps the moths from eating your clothes. And a long time ago, when more clothes were made out of wool and cotton and other natural materials, the moths would, if you stored your clothes for a long time, moths would get in there and eat holes into your clothing. And so these kept them out of your clothes. And last but not least, it's in the title, the word wardrobe. So a wardrobe is like a closet that's not built into your wall. And it's a place you can hang clothing inside of it. All right, so we'll read chapter 1, and then I'll preview you for chapter 2. All right, chapter 1, here we go. Lucy looks into the wardrobe. That's the title of the chapter. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready. and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty. They do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man, with shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face, as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him. And Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to both laugh and had to keep on pretending that he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said goodnight to the professor and went upstairs, on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There was sure to be a row if we were heard talking in here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. And anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to the dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she'd ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading to empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now and say, let's go explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling so thick that when you looked out the window, you could neither see the mountains, nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor, and they were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them. A long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction, one in the other. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore the house." Everyone agreed to this. And that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of. It was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried only led into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor. And after that was a room all hung in green, with a harp in one corner. And then came 3 steps down, and 5 steps up, and a kind of little upstairs hall, and a door that led out onto a balcony, and the whole series of rooms that led one into the other. They were lined with books, mostly books, very old books, and some bigger even than the Bible in a church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty, except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking glass or mirror in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worth the while trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. And this is the first picture in the book, so I'll show you. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats, and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, Of course, because she knew that it was very foolish to shut oneself inside a wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her as to not bump her face in the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in and then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel woodwork against the tips of her fingers. But she could not feel it. This must simply be an enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, still going further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for more for her. Then she noticed there was something crunching under her feet. I wonder, is that more mothballs? She thought, stooping down to feel with her hand. But instead of feeling the smooth, hard wood floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. This is very queer, she said, and went a step or 2 further. The next moment, she found that what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. Why, this is just like the branches of trees, exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been. But a long way off, something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found she was standing in the middle of a wood at nighttime with the snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it is a very silly thing to shut oneself in a wardrobe. It still seemed to be daylight there. I could always get back if something goes wrong, thought Lucy, and she began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood toward the light. In about 10 minutes, she reached it and found out it was a lamppost. She stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next. We got our next picture. We got our lamppost in the middle of the wood. And she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming toward her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upward, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat's hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face with short pointed beard, curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked like if he had just been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all of his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. And that's the end of chapter 1.